In this tutorial, we are going to look at the basics of creating a terrain in the Unity game engine, sculpting it with some brushes and other asset packs from external sources, and populating the environment with some trees. So let's get started in working with terrains here inside of Unity. We are first going to go under Game Object, 3D, Terrain. And there it is. Terrains are giant flat planes that we can sculpt on. So we can go through and paint in where we would prefer to have mountains or valleys, lakes, things like that. So I am just going to start with this big flat plane. And by selecting it over in the inspector, we see there are a variety of different properties to this terrain. The ones we're going to work with the most are going to be over here underneath the second option, where we can use set height. We can use paint holes, raise and lower terrain, stamp height, or stamp terrain, and a variety of other tools, smoothing. So let's go first. We'll take a look at raise and lower terrain. And there are a variety of different brushes in here. We can change the brush size as well as the brush opacity, and all depending on our size and opacity, we can go through and we can brush in what we want our terrain to look like. There are a variety of different tools that are in here by default. For this demonstration, we are going to use a variety of different external tools. They are these ones. These are the ones that I'm using. So before we move on, I'm quickly going to show how we can import things from the Unity Asset Store if you've never dealt with it before. First, in the Unity Asset Store, you need to be logged in, so you'll have to sign in up here at the top. And then from there, you can search for your selected assets. You can search for what their price is. I normally just go with free assets. I look for a rock, and then you can keep a library of these particular objects. So if I want to import these particular rocks into my project, then I can go into either purchase or add. But since I already have this one, I can just do open Unity, and it's going to prompt me to open that object or that package inside of Unity, and it's going to pop open the package manager. And in here, you can then hit download, and once you've downloaded it, it keeps it local on your machine as far as some of your assets. And then after that, you can click on import, and then it will bring it into your project. So over here in the Unity Asset Store, so if you just go to assetstore.unity.com, I will provide these in a link below. But I am using the Unity, a URP tree. I'm using this set of hills, mountains, and lakes terrain stamp brushes. And then from Polyhaven, I am using this rocky terrain. And I'm only using the diffuse and the normal. And then same thing for this aerial rock and this forest ground set of textures. I'm grabbing 4K of each one, only the diffuse and the normal. I'll link those below. But we're going to use those inside of our terrain here. So I'm going to lower this overall terrain. That way it's like the scene that we're developing here is going to be way up built into a mountain. So we want a valley below. And I'm going to make this terrain larger. By default, a terrain tile is 1000 by 1000. So if we go over to the terrain settings, we can change a number of different things here. Some of them are relative to trees, grouping IDs, when the details on the trees are visible, depending on how far away we are, the terrain width and height, as well as its resolution. So I'm going to change the width and length to 2000 by 2000. I'm going to leave the height at 600, and I'm going to change the resolution per patch as 128, and then for detail resolution, I'm going to set that to 4096, or whatever's going to get me close to it. There we go. And I'm going to move this further down the way because with the little scene that I'm building, we're looking out this little door. So we'll be able to see the mountains and everything through here. So I'm just going to put my game view off to the side, and that way I moved my main camera in my scene so it's rotated looking out that door, so I can see approximately what a player would see from inside of this hangar looking out. So let's grab that terrain. And again, I imported these brushes from the Unity Asset Store. They're free, but they are really helpful in creating some nice terrain objects or terrain details. So I am just going to go over into my brushes again. We can use raise and lower. So raising is if we just drag across, holding shift will shove the geometry down. And the reason why I put my terrain a little low is because this goes down to a 0 value. So if you're planning on doing like valleys and things like that, put the terrain down where you anticipate the bottom of the valley will be, just because you can't push it any further down than that. So if we were to draw on a bunch of terrain and it gets real spiky like this, we can switch over to smooth height and we can smooth out the geometry. We can use set height, and set height allows us to specify a particular height and the geometry will cap off at that particular height. So we can get some plateaus. We can also use shift. If we use the point of our mouse, hold shift and then click on a spot, it will sample whatever the particular height of that location is. So that ends up being really helpful. And we can use local space or we can use world space. I prefer local because I might, again, take that terrain and drop it down a little bit. So if the terrain gets moved, it's going to be important that we're working in local space. Paint holes does as you would think. So if you were anticipating doing like some cave system or something like that, then you can paint out the geometry by painting holes into it. The shader has to recompile from it, but you can see we can paint holes. So if I was going to do it into the side of this cliff over here, then we could put in some cave geometry going into that cliffside. All right, so looking at the stamp terrain, we can use stamp terrain or we can use the raise and lower terrain with some of the brushes. So again, that hills, mountains, and lakes terrain brushes, when you bring those in, they'll appear over here in the brushes menu. So if we use like stamp terrain and I select this one, we can set the stamp height. And we can kind of stamp in those mesh details. So see, very quickly, we could use some of these and stamp in some nice details here in the distance. Change the height. That creates some nice organic shape design through here. So then we don't have just this big flat terrain space. So I'm actually going to go back under set height. I'm going to go to local, set the height back to 0 and flatten tile. So I'm just going to start over. And let's go back to that stamp terrain. And let's play with some of these different shapes in here. There's all kinds of different ones. Utilization of free assets is awesome, so definitely take advantage of it when there are free assets available to you. You are welcome to use them. So they can speed up the process, they can help you with ideation. It's important to make sure to add in your own flair there. Otherwise, it's just gonna feel like something out of the box sometimes. Here we are. So I want maybe some hills. Ooh. Some hills down here. Nothing too crazy, but I want to distinguish the base of the mountains over here from everything else. So maybe we have a little bit of a valley there. Some ridges coming down these mountains. Looks okay. This is a little too uniform. So break that up a little bit. There we go. Looking a little better. Okay. So there we go. So we have some nice terrain going through here. And there are lots of different terrain tools that you can get through the Unity Asset Store. Some of them will help with the sculpting process, other ones with the texturing process. So over in Unity, I've already imported a variety of the aerial rocks. I'll remove those for the time being. I've already imported the aerial rocks, the forest ground, and the rocky terrain textures that I got off of Polyhaven. And let's add those to our terrain so that it can be painted. So going back over into our terrain by selecting it, going down to paint texture, we can add in textures to be applied to our terrain. So I'm going to go under Edit, Edit Terrain Layers, Create Layer. And I'm going to search first for this forest ground. So forest ground, right there. And if I select it, then it's going to apply that texture to the entirety of the terrain. So if we select it, and we'll see it pop up over here. I have, again, I imported these, put them into my tiling textures folder, and then put a folder in there called terrain. So it created this new layer. So I'll call this layer _ grass. And that is what's being used here underneath my terrain. So if I ever need to grab a hold of it, I can get to it right here without having to go to my terrain necessarily to grab a hold of it. So I'm going to grab and drop in the normal map. And then down here under the tiling size, I'm going to increase this to say 30 by 30. Now we can see the grass on here a little bit better. The larger this number is, the bigger that the grass is going to show up on the terrain. So that looks pretty good at like 50 by 50. So I'm okay with that. We do have access to a mask map where if we put the metallic, ambient occlusion, and the smoothness in these appropriate channels, so red is metallic, green is ambient occlusion, and alpha is smoothness, then we could control things like how metallic the landscape is, whether or not it's utilizing an ambient occlusion or a smoothness. Otherwise, we can just use these sliders, which that's what I'm going to do for this. I'm going to add in another layer. So let's add in the rocky terrain. So we'll add that, and now we have this new layer, and it popped up over here. So we'll call that layer rocky. And I'm going to drag and drop the normal map into that as well. And now that I have this second layer, I can scroll down to where my brushes are, and I can actually paint that texture onto my terrain. Now you can see right here that it's super tiny, so that has to do with this tiling. So if we increase that tiling to say 50 and 50, then we can see it a little bit clearer. The other thing is you can blend with the opacity. So if you want to give a larger space, maybe just a little bit of a blending of that texture as we're going from say grass up into the mountains, we can definitely do that just by adjusting the alpha. So I'm gonna just brush in some of this. And we can always go back to the grass and brush some more grass back in. But I'm going to just go through here and I'm going to brush in this for a little bit more color and variety so we can see over here how some of the colors changing up on those mountains as we're painting in this material. So it might be a little strong right now, but I can always go back and again blend in a little bit more of that grass. But I want some nice variety right now is what I'm looking for. There we go. I'm gonna go back to that grass layer now and just with a lower opacity, I'm gonna go back over some of this. Let's drop that opacity a little more, just because it's getting to be too vibrant in some of these areas. So we're just gonna tone it down. Oh, it's kind of nice. You can full screen a window in Unity by holding Shift and hitting spacebar. That'll full screen you into something like the game view or the scene view. Super handy little tool. All right, let's add in our last layer here. So we will add in this aerial rock. I see it right here, so let's click on it. Now we have a new layer, aerial rock. Layer, aerial rock. So let's add in the normal for that. And we'll change the tiling of that. I'll do like 50 and 50 again for that and just see how it looks. So we'll start brushing in some of this aerial rock then. I might change the size of my brush. And get some nice blending between those three different rock types, or I guess those two different rock types, but three different textures. There are some nice tools inside of the asset store that actually help with this blending process and will automatically do it based on the height differentials of sculpted elements, which is pretty cool. But we're just going to use these real simple tools. Just the basic built-in ones. Don't want to introduce anything that's too far out in the weeds. I think that looks pretty nice. We'll go with that. All right, so if we wanted to go through and add in some trees, if we go to our terrain, we'll go under our paint trees option. And again, I downloaded that other asset from the Unity Asset Store, which is this tree pack. And underneath of it, there's a prefab with 3 different trees. And so I'm going to go over to my paint trees, and I'm just going to end up using the one tree. And the reason is because the trees end up being so far away that we don't actually get to see them all that well. They do well at populating the scene, but because they are so far away, we don't get a chance to really see and appreciate much of them. So when creating trees, we can set what we want the height bounds to be, and it'll randomize the creation of the tree within a certain set of height. We get a brush, and then we get a tree density. So let's do edit, add tree, and it's going to ask for a tree. So I'm going to go under that tree pack, URP tree pack, prefabs, and I'm going to grab this third tree and drag and drop it in and hit add. And now I have a tree in my brush here. And so I can just start painting in trees. So we can change the density. If we want to be sparser, then we can drop the tree density. We make it real low. So every time we click, then it's going to not be nearly as dense. I want more trees kind of down in this valley area or coming up the sides. And we can always remove them by holding control. So if we wanted to really control where some of these trees were, so we did have more of an open area here in the middle, we can adjust that. We zoom in though, you can see how dense all these trees actually are in this space. Now when you pull back, again, the engine is simplifying them. But you do get a good sense of just how many trees there actually are there and how densely populated this really is once you get in here. So if you were to have a player zooming through this place, you can see that there would just be a ton of trees through here. But I think that looks pretty decent as far as its population. We're only going to spawn in trees. You can add in more. So again, you can grab different sorts of trees from the asset store. You can make some of your own. You can also do paint details. So if you want to paint in grasses or if you want to paint in rocks, you can do that as well. So if you go new brush, or I'm sorry, new brush, you could specify an object that you wanted to bring in for a paint detail. Super helpful for things like, again, rocks or other things that you might populate the scene with. With the trees, here we go. With the paint details, you can add in detail meshes. Those are like rocks and things. They do not have collision, so it's good for if you have like ground rocks. You can use detail meshes for that. And then you can also bring in grass and paint the grass on the terrain as well. Again, because we're so far away, I'm not going to bother with that in this instance. Terrains by default do have colliders to them. So if we had a player that jumped out of our little hangar here into that space, then they would be able to run on top of the terrain with no problem whatsoever. I'm going to leave it off there as being an introduction to terrains for sculpting them and placing objects on them. here inside of the Unity game engine.